Welcome back, everybody. Today we're looking into something that's been in the news quite a bit lately,
Uh-huh.
agency nurses and the NHS. You've probably heard all about how much they cost. But get this,
Yeah.
using them can actually save the NHS money.
Mm.
Sounds kind of crazy, huh?
Yeah. It does seem counterintuitive. I mean, especially with all the news stories about sky-high agency costs.
Yeah.
So let's unpack that a little bit and see why those headlines might not be giving you the full picture.
Okay, I am all ears. Because I'll admit, I was surprised too when I saw the research. So
Yeah.
help me understand this. Where do we even begin?
Well, let's start with that big, scary number everyone throws around, £3 billion.
Yeah.
Supposedly, how much agencies cost the NHS each year?
Yeah, that's the one that sticks in my mind too. That sounds like a massive drain on resources.
Exactly. But that number needs some context. For starters, it's already outdated.
Okay.
You see, a few years back, there were these things called off-framework agencies that were charging insane amounts.
Framework agencies. What's that all about?
Mm-hmm.
Sounds kind of shady.
It kind of was. Just think of it like this: on-framework agencies are the good guys. They've got to deal with the NHS. They agree to set fees for their nurses, so everything's transparent and controlled.
Okay.
But off-framework agencies, they were like the Wild West, charging whatever they wanted, sometimes like thousands for a single shift.
Oh, wow. So they were the ones really driving up those costs and giving agencies a bad name.
Exactly. But here's the good news. The NHS cracked down hard. Off-framework agencies are basically extinct, now gone. So that $3 billion figure already way off.
Oh, okay. So that headline-grabbing number is already misleading. But even with those off-framework agencies gone, surely those on-framework agencies are still costing a pretty penny, right?
Let's break down that remaining cost because it's not as straightforward as it seems. First, remember, agencies are businesses. They pay taxes just like everyone else. 20% of that £3 billion goes straight back to the government as VAT. That's $500 million right there.
Okay, so a big chunk of that money is already coming back to the government. What about the rest?
Here's the big one. 87% of the remaining cost goes directly to the nurses themselves. That's their salary. We're talking about highly skilled professionals providing essential care. It makes sense that the bulk of that money goes to them.
So hold on, the agencies aren't pocketing this huge profit like some people think?
Not at all. Once you factor in their operating costs, like things like staff, office space, keeping everything legal, their profit margin is actually pretty small.
Okay, this has blown my mind. The whole narrative about agencies being this huge drain on the NHS is starting to crumble.
And there's one more piece of the puzzle that really flips the script. Taxes, remember that $2.175 billion going to the nurses. Well, they pay income tax on that, just like anyone else.
Right.
Let's just say a conservative estimate of 25% goes back to the government. That's another $544 million.
So if we're keeping score here, the government is getting back at least $1 billion of that initial £3 billion?
Yeah.
That's a third.
Exactly. It really highlights how misleading that initial figure can be without the full context.
This is eye-opening. Okay, but I still have one burning question. Wouldn't it just be cheaper for the NHS to employ those nurses directly? Cut out the middleman, so to speak.
Now that, my friend, is where it gets really interesting, because the answer is not necessarily.
Oh, seriously, how is that even possible?
Well, you have to remember, employing someone isn't just about their take-home pay. The NHS as an employer has to pay additional contributions like national insurance pension contributions, even an apprenticeship levy. All of those costs add up.
So there are all these hidden costs you don't always think about.
You got it. And when you factor those in, the hourly cost of employing someone directly through the NHS can actually be higher than what the NHS pays those on-framework agencies for a nurse with the same experience level. We've got a figure here that illustrates this point perfectly.
Oh yeah, this figure shows the breakdown for a Band 5 nurse in inner London. Let's see. Whoa. It looks like the government actually saves money by using agency nurses, especially those with more experience.
Right. For nurses with over 4 years of experience, which is the majority of agency nurses, by the way, the savings can be as much as £5.71 per hour.
That's huge. We hear all the time about how agencies are bleeding the NHS dry. But it looks like the opposite is true. Using these approved framework agencies is actually saving money.
That's right. And there's another layer to this whole cost issue. It has to do with something called staff banks, which are internal pools of nurses that NHS trusts use to fill extra shifts.
Staff banks, I think I've heard of those, but could you explain exactly what they are and how they fit into all of this?
Of course. Basically, before an NHS trust turns to an agency, they first try to fill any gaps with nurses from their own staff bank. Think of it like an internal temp agency for each hospital. It seems logically right. Keep things in-house first.
Makes sense. So what's the catch?
Well, the catch is that these staff banks often pay nurses more than agencies do for the same work.
Hold on, that doesn't make sense. Why would they pay more?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that defeat the purpose of trying to save money?
It's a bit of a head-scratcher. I know while the intention is probably to incentivize nurses to stay within the trust and avoid using agencies, it ends up shifting the cost burden internally and potentially increasing the overall cost.
So we've got this complex situation where agencies can actually be more cost-effective than direct employment, and staff banks sometimes pay even more than agencies. My head is spinning.
It definitely highlights how tangled this whole issue is, and it shows that we need to take a much more strategic and nuanced approach to workforce planning in the NHS.
Folks, I think we need a moment to process all of this. This deep dive is already full of surprises. We'll be back in a flash to continue untangling this fascinating and complex world of agency nurses and the NHS.
It's amazing how much we think we know about a topic,
Yeah.
until we really start digging into the details.
Right. I feel like my assumptions about agency nurses and the NHS have been completely turned upside down.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how headlines and sound bites can really oversimplify a complex issue. The reality is much more nuanced, as we've seen.
Absolutely. So just to recap for our listeners, we've debunked that scary £3 billion figure. We've seen how much of that money actually goes back to the government through taxes. And we've even discovered that using those approved framework agencies can be more cost-effective than directly employing nurses. In some cases, it's a lot to take in.
It is. And remember that whole staff bank situation where hospitals sometimes pay more to fill shifts internally than they would through an agency. It really highlights the need for a more strategic approach to workforce management within the NHS.
It seems like there are a lot of inefficiencies in the system.
Exactly. Throwing money at the problem, whether it's through inflated staff bank rates or relying heavily on agencies, isn't a sustainable solution.
Okay, so we've laid out the problem and busted some myths. But what about solutions? Where do we go from here?
Well, the source material we're looking at today actually offers some potential paths forward. One of the key suggestions is for the government to shift its perspective on agencies instead of seeing them as the enemy. They should be viewed as a potential partner in creating a more balanced and efficient workforce.
So a more collaborative approach. That's interesting.
Exactly. The idea is to leverage the expertise and flexibility that agencies offer while also working to address the root causes of the staffing challenges within the NHS.
Okay, I like where this is going. So how do we actually put this collaborative approach into action? What are the concrete steps?
Well, there are several key areas to focus on. First, we need to make permanent NHS roles more attractive to nurses. That means addressing issues like heavy workloads, burnout, and making sure that pay and benefits are competitive.
So basically making the NHS a better place to work for nurses.
Exactly. If we can create a work environment that values and supports nurses, we can improve retention rates and reduce the reliance on agencies. It's about investing in that core workforce.
Makes sense. What else?
We also need to take a hard look at the way staff banks are managed. Remember how we talked about them sometimes paying more than agencies? We need to make sure they are operating efficiently and that their pay rates are aligned with the overall goal of cost effectiveness.
So making sure that staff banks are actually contributing to the solution, not inadvertently making the problem worse.
Right. And when agencies are needed, the focus should be on using those on-framework agencies, the ones that operate within the agreed-upon system and offer fair rates to their nurses.
It's about creating a system where everyone benefits the NHS, the nurses, and ultimately the patients who rely on the system.
Exactly. And it requires a shift in mindset, moving away from blame and toward a more collaborative and understanding approach.
You know, when we started this deep dive, I had no idea we'd uncover so much complexity and so many potential solutions. It's really fascinating to see how something that seems so straightforward on the surface can be so nuanced.
It's a great reminder that we should always dig deeper, question assumptions, and look for those hidden layers of information.
And speaking of hidden layers, remember how we asked you to think about why those negative headlines about agencies persist, even though the reality is more complex?
Yes, that's a key question we need to explore further. There are a lot of potential explanations for that discrepancy between perception and reality.
Well, before we dive into that, let's take a quick pause to gather our thoughts. We'll be back in a moment to continue this deep dive into the world of agency nurses and the NHS. Welcome back to our deep dive into agency nurses and the NHS. We were talking about how the public perception of agencies doesn't always match up with the facts we've been looking at.
Right, we've seen how using on-framework agencies can actually save money, but the headlines often paint a very different picture.
Yeah.
So the question is, why does that negative perception persist?
Okay, let's try to unravel that.
Yeah.
What are some possible reasons for this disconnect between reality and public perception?
Well, part of it might be the lingering memory of those off-framework agencies we talked about. They were charging outrageous fees, and those stories really made a splash in the news, even though those agencies are gone now. That negative association with agencies might still be stuck in people's minds.
Like a bad first impression, that's hard to shake even if things have changed.
Exactly, and it's easier to focus on a villain, like agencies in this case, than to grapple with the complex issues within the NHS that lead to a reliance on agency staff in the first place. It's a simpler narrative to digest.
So instead of examining the systemic problems, it's easier to just point the finger at agencies and say they're the problem.
You got it. And let's not forget the political angle for politicians criticizing agency spending can be a way to look like they're being tough on wasteful spending, even if that criticism isn't totally accurate.
It's all about playing to the audience sometimes, even if it means oversimplifying the issue.
Unfortunately, yes. And that kind of rhetoric can distract from the need for more comprehensive solutions that actually address the root causes of the NHS staffing challenges.
It sounds like we need a major shift in perspective, both from the public and from policymakers, to really get a handle on this issue.
I agree. We need to move away from the blame game and start thinking about agencies as a potential partner in creating a more sustainable and efficient workforce model for the NHS.
So how do we make that happen? How do we get everyone on board with this more collaborative approach?
Well, for starters, we need to keep having these conversations. We need to spread the word about the real costs and benefits of using on-framework agencies and dispel those outdated myths.
So education is key. The more people understand the facts, the more likely they are to support solutions that actually work.
Exactly. And we need to make sure that policymakers are hearing this message loud and clear. They need to understand that working with agencies, not against them, is essential for creating a more stable and cost-effective NHS workforce.
It's about moving beyond those short-sighted solutions and thinking about the long-term health of our healthcare system.
Right. And ultimately, it's about ensuring that patients receive the best possible care. That means having enough nurses, both permanent and agency, to meet the demand.
Well, folks, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of agency nurses and the NHS. It's been quite a journey full of twists and turns, and I hope you learned something new along the way.
I think the key takeaway here is that complexity is often lurking beneath the surface of what seems like a simple issue.
Absolutely. It's crucial to dig deeper, question assumptions, and seek out diverse perspectives to really understand the nuances of these challenges. And when it comes to something as important as healthcare, we can't afford to settle for easy answers or scapegoats.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.